Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And as promised last week, here is my exploration of the life of Margaret Tudor. 3 weeks ago, we looked at her sister, Mary Tudor. And I started that video by looking at the TV series The Tudors and the character portrayed by Gabrielle Anwar, whose life, as it is presented on screen in the TV series, broadly follows the track taken by Mary Tudor. Confusingly, however, she is called Margaret in the Tudors TV series. As will become clear, I believe, the name is the only thing that the real Margaret actually shares with the character that bears her name in the show. And it's not because her life was uneventful. Indeed, as is so often the case, I would argue that her story is rich enough to supply enough material for a TV series all of her own. So, let's jump in. Margaret Tudor was born at Westminster Palace on the 28th of November 1489 to Elizabeth of York and King Henry VII. She was her parents' second child, her elder brother Arthur being some 3 years her senior. Margaret had been born into a new royal dynasty. Her father's defeat of Richard III at Bosworth Field had taken place just a little over 4 years before her birth, on the 22nd of August 1485. Although Henry would date his accession to the throne and kingship to the 21st of August 1485, the day before the battle. We have the benefit of being able to assess the reality of the situation from the perspective of historians. We know that Henry VII would hold the throne, die in his bed, and have his son inherit from him unchallenged, which was quite the feat considering what had occurred in preceding years. But I do wonder what it would have felt like for Margaret and the other young Tudors, born as the physical embodiment of the unifying peace of the House of York and Lancaster, the actual Tudor roses themselves. To grow up in the shadow of that conflict, the thing of their forebears that had cost so many lives and caused such discord. How much would Margaret have known or felt of it as she grew up, first at Sheen Palace and then, following a devastating fire at Sheen, at Eltham Palace? We do know that Margaret's education would have been similar to that of her sister Mary, so she would have had tutors to school her in Latin and French, while it was probably the noble ladies who surrounded her and served her that taught her the skills expected of a fashionable and honourable princess, such as the playing of instruments like the lute, dancing, courtly games and pursuits, and of course embroidery. It is noted that Margaret was particularly good at one courtly pursuit in particular, that being archery. So, in other words, watch out. From her birth, it would have been understood that Margaret's future would almost certainly involve a diplomatically significant marriage. On the 5th of May 1496, 6 months before her 7th birthday, negotiations got underway to arrange Margaret's marriage to the King of Scots, James IV. It was not all smooth sailing, as, among other causes of delay, it would not be long before Anglo-Scottish tensions bubbled up, when James IV chose to support a challenge to Henry VII. This challenge came in the form of someone who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes in the Tower, specifically the younger prince. Henry VII denounced him as the pretender Perkin Warbeck. Nevertheless, despite this snafu, the negotiations would come to their intended conclusion, and an agreement would be reached. The marriage treaty was concluded on the 24th of January 1502. I'm sure that Margaret's thoughts of her future in Scotland would no doubt be massively obscured by the loss of her eldest brother, her father's heir, Prince Arthur, because he would be dead within months. Arthur died on the 2nd of April, 1502, But Margaret would still have to forge on to make her marriage, and she would have a proxy marriage that took place the following year, on the 15th of January 1503. At this proxy marriage, the King of Scots was represented by the Earl of Bothwell. But more loss came hot on the heels of this event too. Margaret's mother died from complications from childbirth on the 11th of February 1503. The baby girl she had given birth to had also died within days of that birth. 5 months after the death of her mother, on the 8th of July 1503, Margaret began her journey north to join James IV, to meet her new people and have her marriage formally celebrated. This celebration took place in the Holyrood House Chapel on the 8th of August 1503. Margaret was a few months shy of her 14th birthday. Her new husband and king was 30. James IV had mistresses before and during his marriage, with whom he would have several children. But Margaret's own maternal journey would not be an easy one. Her first son, named James for his father, was born on the 21st of February 1507. But very sadly, he would die just over a year later, on the 27th of February 1508. Margaret would have another loss very soon on the heels of this, because she would have a baby girl who we think was stillborn on the 15th of July 1508. More loss would come the following year, because Margaret's father, Henry VII, died on the 21st of April 1509. Margaret was now an orphan. She was nearly 20. The new King of England was her little brother. He was nearly 18 years old. Margaret and James IV would have only one child who would survive infancy, a boy also called James, born on the 10th of April 1512. This baby, heir to the throne of Scotland, would not remember his father, because James IV saw an opportunity. With his brother-in-law waging war in France, leaving his wife, Katherine of Aragon, as regent in England, James thought it was a fitting time to mount his own attack to the nation to the south. Margaret's marriage was designed to create an affinity between England and Scotland. But as we see, within just 6 years of it being celebrated, her husband was now ignoring her pleas and setting up to wage war on her former homeland. But James underestimated his opponents, especially, it seems, his sister-in-law, Katherine of Aragon. He and many of his nobles would be killed at the Battle of Flodden on the 9th of September 1513. In the will left behind by her husband James IV, Margaret had been named as regent. She, assisted by a council of 4 nobles, was therefore tasked with managing the rule of her 17-month-old son, who was now being recognised as King James V of Scots. Not long after his accession, James V would get another brother. Margaret would give birth to Alexander on the 30th of April 1514, and unfortunately this child would also be another who would die young, because he would only survive until the 18th of September 1515. But before this loss, just over a year after she had been widowed, on the 6th of August 1514, Margaret would marry again. Her new husband was the extraordinarily powerful Scots nobleman Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus. This marriage is frequently framed as being an oversight or mistake on Margaret's part, because her first husband's will had specified that her position as regent was contingent on her remaining unmarried. So, by remarrying, she no longer had the right to that role, which surely she must have understood. The act also enraged her brother, Henry VIII, who was not best pleased that she had married without his permission. Margaret's marriage to Angus occurred less than a year before her sister Mary's marriage to Charles Brandon. If Henry had hoped for biddable sisters, then surely the events of 1514 to 1515 must have come as quite the shock. I see Margaret's second marriage as an act of desperation rather than simply headstrong folly. I think it was her way of trying to secure her rights and amplify her power in the face of the resistance that many around her were showing her. Because, let's be clear, Margaret was fighting an uphill battle. She was a woman occupying a position of power, and that in itself was distasteful. Added to this, she was also distrusted in Scotland because she was an English princess, someone who they thought might, and arguably probably would, put her brother's interests above those of the Scottish people. The preference of many in Scotland was that James IV's cousin, John Stuart, Duke of Albany, should come and be regent instead. Albany's sympathies were with Scotland and also with France, because England's perennial enemy, namely France, was where Albany had grown up and where he was currently living. That was until he was invited back to Scotland to take up the role of regent, which he did. Despite her pleas, her brother Henry VIII wasn't prepared to use force to see the regency returned to his sister. He did try and ultimately fail to take custody of James V and his brother Alexander, which didn't work out very well for Margaret, because in response to this, she was compelled to surrender custody of her children herself. Any reason for her to stay in Scotland was now removed. But with the loss of the custody of her children, one of them being the King of Scots, the danger to her only increased. Margaret, heavily pregnant with her second husband's child, fled to England. Within days, on the 7th of October 1515, Margaret gave birth to a baby girl that she named Margaret Douglas. It was a hard birth that nearly cost Margaret Tudor her life. It took her months to recover. Indeed, she would not be able to reach London until the 3rd of May 1516. It was during this convalescence that her son Alexander died, and those around her delayed in telling her of her loss because they were worried that it may be too painful a shock, and in her weakened state might even be enough to kill her. Soon, Margaret would be able to return to Scotland. Henry VIII offered both a carrot and a stick. There were offers of diplomacy and also the enaction of violent raids. And just over a year after they begun, these methods proved successful. The Duke of Albany was recalled by the French king, and before he left, he pronounced that Margaret Tudor should have liberty and safety to return to Scotland to be reunited with her husband Angus and also with her valuable properties, which had been denied to her while she was in England, despite them being her right. Margaret set off on the 18th of May 1517. What Margaret found when she returned to Scotland was a husband who had taken to living with his mistress and using the money that was due to Margaret from her estates to fund his and his lady friend's lifestyle. Also, her relationship with her surviving son James V was tightly controlled, for fear that she might influence or even abscond with him. Margaret was thus impoverished, disempowered, and, I would imagine, incredibly lonely. She asked to be allowed to return to England, but her brother Henry refused her. So she looked for a way to end her marriage. She even petitioned for the Duke of Albany to return from France. This did occur in 1521. She convinced Albany to support her formal and final separation from Angus. Angus and those loyal to him used this as evidence of an adulterous relationship and even a treasonous pact between Margaret and Albany. It seems that they were alleging that she was planning to murder her son and rule in his place with Albany, which seems odd. Upon hearing of these rumours, particularly those involving an illicit relationship between Margaret and Albany, Henry sent his sister a sharp and unkind letter, which we are told caused her great distress. Albany was keen to invade England. Naturally, Henry wanted him removed from power and also from his doorstep. As regent, Albany was not able to obtain the annulment that Margaret wanted, but at least he did get her husband out of Scotland. He banished Angus to France in 1522. Albany himself returned to France in the October of that year, and he left in his stead a regency council, which he chose not to include Margaret in. I can't imagine that would have impressed her very much. Albany ping-ponged back and forth between Scotland and France over the next couple of years. When he was in Scotland, he was the acting regent. When he left behind a council. It was, I'm sure, quite disruptive and very disempowering and annoying for Margaret. Margaret sought support from her brother and from others to allow her son to be recognised as being fully the king with no need for a regent. The 12-year-old James V was recognised as king in his own right and confirmed as such by Parliament on the 20th of August 1524. But despite this being what Margaret wanted, it clearly wasn't going to be the end of her problems, because it was understood that James V would need help to rule. After all, he was 12. But it seems that Margaret was considered to be unreliable for the purpose, and this was apparently the case in both Scotland and in England. The husband that Margaret despised, whom she, despite her best efforts, could not find a way to be rid of, escaped his French exile and came to London in 1524, where, according to reports, he was warmly welcomed by Henry VIII. So, as we can see, there's nothing like some brotherly loyalty being shown there. With the backing of some Scottish nobles, and also apparently Henry VIII himself, Angus was able to force his way into the government of Scotland in February 1525. Within months of this, Angus was able to take and hold the custody of James V. There had been a pre-existing arrangement that the custody of James V would rotate between noblemen, with 3 months being the agreed upon time span for each of the nobles to hold this custody. Angus decided that without prior agreement, he would extend his custody period. Indeed, he would manage to keep hold of the king, and therefore governmental power, until 1528. A wedge had been placed between Margaret and her son, the king, her chances of influencing him being massively diminished because the husband that she hated, and who probably hated her too, held him. On top of this, she would surely have held no hope that she could even trust her own brother anymore. And to be clear, Henry would double down on this poor behaviour, by the way. Some hope may have been generated for Margaret when the Pope granted her annulment from Angus on the 11th of March 1527. It was rumoured that Margaret had loved another for years, and she would marry again, soon after her annulment, in secret. Her third husband was the man that she was rumoured to have loved for so long, Henry Stuart. Margaret publicly shared news of their marriage in the spring of 1528. But her former husband Angus still held the king, her son, and he weaponised this position to arrest Margaret's new husband for marrying her without royal permission. But James V was now 16, and seemingly was pretty keen to slip out of his former stepfather's control. It would appear that the son did not love him any more than the mother had. James was successful and managed to escape his stepfather in May 1528. With Angus removed from power, Margaret's husband Henry Stuart was freed and returned to her. A year later, Angus would be forced from Scotland, having been denounced as a traitor by Parliament. He was, however, welcomed in England. Indeed, even more, he was granted a pension by Henry VIII that would support him for over a decade. Remember a little bit ago when I said about how Margaret's brother would double down on disloyalty to his sister? Well, there you go. Margaret, for her part, comes across as being magnanimous in the face of this, frankly, enormous betrayal by her brother. However, before I talk about the way she behaves going forward, maybe it's not about being magnanimous. Maybe we should read her future actions in a different way. It's possible that Margaret recognised that she had very few options, that if she was going to get support, which she may have felt she needed to ensure her safety and certainly her comfort in life going forward, that she would need allies. Maybe she felt that her best option was with the devil, or rather brother, she knew. But certainly, she did encourage her son to form close bonds with England and with his uncle Henry. It seems that she hoped that her son James would marry her niece Mary, and so cement an Anglo-Scottish alliance with that customary marriage. Despite Margaret's encouragements, her son James V's own preference was for a French alliance, and so, on the 1st of January 1537, he married Madeleine, one of the daughters of King Francis I of France. But Madeleine's health had long been a cause for concern. In fact, her father Francis wasn't keen on James marrying her, apparently. He was worried that she would not survive the journey from France to Scotland. As it was, she did survive the trip, but she would die within months of her marriage. She passed away on the 7th of July, 1537. James was in need of another wife, but once again he would not look to England, but back to France for this need to be fulfilled. He married Mary of Guise in 1538. As her son was making these French marriages, Margaret's own marriage, an apparent love match to Henry Stuart, itself became strained. Henry Stuart had fathered a child with a mistress. As well as this, he was spending his wife's money to the point that she was left with substantial debts. Poor Margaret. It does seem somewhat that her matrimonial history was repeating itself. Unsurprisingly, she was keen for another annulment, swiftly this time. It had worked before, now she wants it done quicker, no doubt. But on this occasion, she would not achieve her aims, no matter how long she waited. In desperation, she tried to flee to England in October 1537, but she was intercepted and was not successful in doing this either. She was trapped. It's hard not to feel sorry for Margaret as she begins to reach what will be the twilight of her life. Margaret finds herself once again stuck in a marriage to a man that she distrusts and despises, and not without cause. Additionally, her son was a grown man, now a twice-married grown man, who had little interest in listening to his mother's advice. Her own brother would not deign to invite her to return to England either, and in fact kept in fairly limited contact with her. At the end, Margaret is believed to have suffered a stroke. She requested that her son, James, would come to see her, but he would not arrive quickly enough to say goodbye. Margaret died on the 18th of October, 1541. Margaret Tudor was, through her son James V, the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and through her daughter Margaret Douglas, she was also the grandmother of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. For those of you who are keeping score, this makes her the great-grandmother, both on the maternal and paternal side, of James VI of Scots and First of England. Margaret Douglas's other son, Charles Stuart, married Elizabeth Cavendish, the daughter of Bess of Hardwicke, and thus he fathered Arbella or Arabella Stuart, who some would promote as a rival to her cousin James for the throne of England after the death of Elizabeth I. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II is a direct descendant of Margaret Tudor. That Margaret's direct lineage is still on the throne is apparently something that runs directly contrary to the wishes and plans of her brother Henry VIII. In the Act of Succession of 1544, it was enacted by Parliament, thus making it law, quote, that the King's Highness shall have full power and authority to give, dispose, appoint, assign, declare and limit by his gracious letters patents under his great seal, or else, and this is the important bit, by his Highness' last will made in writing and signed with his most gracious hand. At his only pleasure, from time to time hereafter, the imperial crown of this realm and all other premises, to such person or persons in remainder or reversion as shall please his Highness. It appears that the King may have been intending to take advantage of the powers given to him by this Act, because Henry VIII's last will, made in December 1536, so within a month of his death, sets down his plan for the succession, which is described as follows. As to the succession of the crown, it shall go to Prince Edward and the heirs of his body. In default, to Henry's children by his present wife, Queen Katherine, or any future wife. Any future wife? I mean, you're on your deathbed, but I guess there's nothing like a bit of hope, is there? Continuing. In default to his daughter Mary and the heirs of her body, upon condition that she shall not marry without the written and sealed consent of a majority of the surviving members of the Privy Council, appointed by him to his son Prince Edward. In default to his daughter Elizabeth, upon like condition. In default to the heirs of the body of Lady Frances, the eldest daughter of his late sister, the French Queen. In default to those of Lady Eleanor, the second daughter of the said French Queen, and in default to his right heirs. Either Mary or Elizabeth, failing to observe the conditions aforesaid, shall forfeit all right to the succession. Despite being his eldest sibling, which means something in the usual terms of succession, Margaret and her heirs have been pointedly overlooked here. This will has Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, being followed by the children of Henry's younger sister, Mary. However, this will did not officially meet the terms of the 1544 Act, because it was not signed by the King's own fair hand, and certainly he may have been too ill to do so. But rather, it was sealed with a dry stamp. So I think we have to ask ourselves, was this indeed Henry's plan? Is this what he actually wanted the succession to be like, or did those around him alter it using that dry stamp? Was it them that did not want a Scottish monarch on the throne of England, especially a Scottish Catholic monarch on the throne of England, as many of the councillors surrounding Henry, setting up to be regents over his son Edward, were certainly of the reforming faith? So potentially we have two ways of viewing this last will and what it means for the succession. On the one hand, we buy that it is what it claims to be, that Henry dictates this on what turns out to be his deathbed, that it's completely his plan and his counsellors are just doing as they are told and dry stamping it because the king is too weak. Alternatively, there is the complete opposite way of reading it, that his counsellors were completely aware of how sick the king was, that they knew he did not have long for this world, and that they wanted to ensure the security and safety of the realm as they wanted it to be, namely, with no Scottish monarch on the English throne. Is it possible that his counsellors wrote Henry's last will and testament to their own designs? And if that's the case, did Henry even ever see it before he died? Well, those are certainly some big questions. But what do you think? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. Or you can find me on social media. I'll leave links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box. You can follow me there and we can continue this conversation. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then why not share it with some friends? Please also let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. If you think you are subscribed, maybe now is a time to have a little check, just to make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you. And while you're there, checking or subscribing, why not hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.